Silver was trading like a sedated market flat, obedient, while the physical side started slipping out of reach. When the screen stays calm and the real world gets tight, that's not noise. That's the opening bell of a different regime. I wasn't watching silver like a fan. I was watching it like a coroner looking for the first signs that the official story and the real body no longer match. On Sunday night, December 21, 2025. My screens looked boring on purpose, spot-trapped in a neat little range. The kind of chart that makes people yawn and scroll away. That's why it works. Most investors only watch the number. I watch what that number can actually buy. I had the COMEX tape on one monitor and the options chain on another. The third screen was the one that matters when narratives crack. Dealer inventories, wholesale availability, and the little phrases that appear right before a market admits it has a problem. Nothing dramatic at first. No sirens. No breaking news. Just a few inventory pages that took longer to load. A few products that suddenly vanished from search. And a few listings that started reading like legal disclaimers instead of offers. The chart tried to lift twice. Each time it did, a ceiling appeared clean, heavy, and timed like someone had a schedule. It wasn't the normal mess of a market discovering price. It was liquidity arriving at the exact moment momentum would normally build. The volume footprint didn't match the calm headline vibe. Open interest wasn't acting like a sleepy trade. It was acting like positions were being set for something the public wasn't supposed to see yet. I opened the dealer tabs like a pilot checking instruments. One of the bigger outlets had quietly changed shipping estimates. What was 2-3 days last week had become 2-4 weeks. Another had imposed a limit that didn't belong in a market that's fully supplied. A limit is a confession. It means the seller is not managing price. They're managing inventory. And inventory management is what you do when replacement risk becomes the real risk. I kept a running log as the details stacked up. Premiums widening is normal in a frenzy. But this wasn't a frenzy spot, was still pretending it was Sunday football. Yet on common products, the premium spread widened fast. Roughly from about plus $3 Oz to about plus $8 Oz inside a 48-hour window. That's the kind of move you usually see after a headline, not before one. The screen didn't move, but the cost of access did. That's how a shortage begins in modern finance. Price stability on paper, delivery instability in the real world. I checked the chatter, not because I trust it, but because crowd psychology is a dashboard. The loudest voices were doing what they always do when they're blind. Jokes. Memes. Boredom. Silver never moves. Wake me up when it hits the moon. Meanwhile, the stackers quiet, older, disciplined, weren't posting hype. They were posting screenshots of backorder, pre-order, call for availability. They weren't celebrating. They were recording evidence. I picked up the phone. If you want truth in a physical market, you don't ask the internet. You ask the people who have to ship metal on a schedule. I called a bullion desk I'd used before, expecting a routine quote. I didn't get a number. I got a question. How fast do you need it? That's not how this is supposed to work. In a normal market, the questions are about price and size. When the first question becomes time, you're no longer negotiating a trade. You're negotiating a supply chain. I asked what changed. The answer was careful, clipped, like someone trying not to say the wrong thing. Inventory's moving. Replacement's not as predictable. If you're flexible, we can work something. If you need it now, it's different. Different. That's the word professionals use when they don't want to trigger panic, but they need you to understand the rules are shifting. I pushed gently. Was this retail demand? Was it a holiday rush? Was it a one-off? He didn't bite on explanations. He didn't blame investors. He didn't mention a shortage. He said something that matters more than the label. Everyone's asking for immediate. Immediate? Now, delivered. Not exposure. Not allocation sometime next month. The market was starting to pay for certainty. and certainty is the first thing that disappears before any official crisis exists. I went back to the tape. The surface still looked sedated. That's how suppression feels when it works. Calm on screen. Pressure off screen. Every time price tried to lift, it was met like a hand pressing down on a spring. I don't need to claim a cartoon villain to recognize a footprint. In any heavily financialized commodity, you'll find actors whose job is to provide liquidity and manage risk. When their risk becomes existential, the tape starts to look managed. You see it in the timing. You see it in the way rallies die at the same kind of levels. You see it in how the market feels less like a crowd and more like a machine. And then there was the word I wrote in my notes, half joking, half serious, because it describes the phase before the public learns the vocabulary, unobtainium. Not there is no silver on earth. Not the world ends. Just this, the right metal, in the right form, delivered on the right timeline. Start slipping away even while the quoted price remains available for infinite paper trading. That's when I stopped thinking of the chart as the story and started treating it as the cover. The real story was in the small changes limits, lead times, the hesitation in a dealer's voice, the way nobody wanted to promise delivery windows anymore. Those are not retail quirks. Those are early tremors in the distribution layer. Then the curve whispers what the headlines won't. The market starts paying more for immediate delivery. That word slides onto my notes like a warning label backwardation. If silver is abundant, why is now suddenly more valuable than later? Most investors think silver is a trade. I want you to see it as an input because the moment an input becomes strategic, the market stops behaving like a market and starts behaving like a supply chain under stress. The night before, I watched the price stay politely asleep while the physical side started acting nervous. That mismatch is never random. When the screen looks calm, but the people who actually ship metal start speaking in cautious timelines, you're not looking at volatility. You're looking at a system preparing to ration without saying the word. By Wednesday morning, December 24, 2025, I had two worlds running side by side. In the public world, the talking heads were still arguing about rates, inflation prints, and whether risk assets would bounce. In my world, emails, procurement chatter, and the kind of boring documents nobody reads until they become headlines, language was shifting toward constraint. It wasn't dramatic. It was professional, and that's what made it dangerous. To understand the shift, you have to stop thinking of silver as a shiny object and start thinking of it as a performance requirement. In consumer electronics, you can cheap out. You can substitute. You can accept a little heat, a little noise, a little failure. In systems where failure is catastrophic, high reliability power, specialized connectors, plated contacts, certain battery chemistries, you don't get to just use copper and call it a day. Silver shows up not because someone likes the metal, but because physics and reliability don't negotiate. That's the frame most investors miss once an input becomes mission critical. Demand stops acting price sensitive. A strategic buyer doesn't wait for a dip. A strategic buyer doesn't care if your chart looks overbought. A strategic buyer cares whether the parts arrive before the deadline. And deadlines, in that world, aren't financial. They're operational. Then the trigger hit. Not a press release. Not a televised announcement. A leak. It landed in my feed the way real warnings always do, forwarded quietly. Stripped of emotion. Carried by people who don't want attention. A supply chain bulletin tied to a defense contracting channel. The kind of update that reads like a routine status note until you realize what it's describing. A specific, mission-critical silver-plated component, something small enough to be ignored by the public, important enough to stall a program, was flagged as backordered, not slightly delayed, backordered with timelines that had stretched from roughly 6 weeks out to 16-plus weeks. And the line that made my stomach go cold wasn't the lead time. It was the admission embedded inside the phrasing, no buffer inventory available. No buffer. That's how runs out looks in the real world. Not empty shelves on television, empty contingency in the pipeline. No slack. No cushion. The kind of condition that turns a supply chain hiccup into a national security headache the moment anything else goes wrong. Worse. The bulletin carried a scent of priority language, polite words that imply the next step isn't bidding harder. It's moving to the front of the line. Not openly. Not loudly. But with the kind of administrative authority that changes who gets served first without asking the market for permission. If you've never watched a supply chain get militarized, it doesn't look like confiscation. It looks like a memo. I pulled back and asked the only question that matters now. If this metal is becoming strategic, who is quietly taking it off the board? That's when the two whales theory stops sounding like a story and starts sounding like a map. On one side, you have industrial demand that doesn't ring bells, large buyers in tech and AI infrastructure who secure material through contracts. Not headlines. They don't spike the tape because they don't chase spot. They lock supply. On the other side, you have a buyer that can't afford to announce itself. If a defense-linked channel openly competed for physical, it would advertise weakness and trigger public panic. So it behaves differently. It moves through intermediaries. It presses upstream. It treats availability as a priority problem, not a pricing problem. And that's where the public narrative becomes more than wrong. It becomes a cover. Because if people understood that the same metal inside consumer tech is also tied to systems that cannot fail, they would stop treating silver like a hobby. They would start treating it like a strategic choke point. The market would reprice not on enthusiasm, but on necessity. That's why the chart stayed calm while the real world tightened. The calm wasn't proof of abundance. It was proof the paper layer can remain liquid long after the physical layer has begun to seize. The first sign wasn't a spike. It was a leak, a lead time, and a buffer that no longer existed. If the defense machine is short metal, it won't compete like a normal customer. It will pull a lever quietly, legally, upstream. And once that lever moves, the next shortage won't be a chart event. It'll be a distribution event. Here's what most investors never understand until it's too late. The system doesn't have to take your silver. It only has to take the flow, and the flow is controlled far above your local coin shop. After the leak, the conversation changes. People stop arguing about whether the chart looks bullish and start asking a darker question. What happens when a market that trades endless paper claims runs into a bottleneck that only ships atoms? By Friday night, December 26, 2025. I was watching the place where confidence goes to be tested, not social media, not headlines, but the plumbing, the curve, the collateral schedules, the delivery language, and the way professionals behave when they're trying to keep something orderly. The first tell wasn't a spike. It was the shape of the prices across time. When a commodity is truly comfortable, the market pays you to wait. When it's stressed, the market pays you to take it now. That's what backwardation whispers without ever raising its voice. Immediate metal is being treated as more valuable than future metal. Not because the world ran out overnight, but because the next marginal ounce that can actually be delivered is becoming scarce relative to the claims written against it. I pulled up the front month versus the next month and watched the spread twitch like a warning light. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was a persistent refusal to relax. That matters. Because spreads don't care about narratives. They're the market's private confession. And the confession was this. The system was getting paid to postpone delivery while simultaneously being incentivized to secure metal sooner. Those incentives don't coexist peacefully for long. At the same time, the options layer started behaving like dry tinder. When volatility rises in a heavily optioned market, dealers don't get to have an opinion. They hedge. And hedging is mechanical. If price drifts upward and a large block of calls sits near the money, delta changes fast. Dealers buy futures to stay neutral. That buying can push price higher, which increases delta again, which forces more buying. That's the gamma squeeze in its pure form. No conspiracy. No hype. Just risk systems responding to exposure. Now add the other half of the trap. shorts who assumed the physical market would always be there as a backstop. If price rises into a tight delivery window, margin requirements don't politely ask how you feel about it. They expand. Collateral gets called. Positions get trimmed. Some shorts cover because they want to. Others cover because they're forced to. That's how a short squeeze begins in the real world, not with drama, but with math. I messaged a contact who lives closer to clearing than to Twitter. He didn't talk like an investor. He talked like a person whose only job is to prevent cascading failure. Liquidity's fine, he wrote, until it isn't. The problem isn't trading. The problem is what happens if too many people ask for the same thing at once. He didn't have to say the word. Delivery. That's when the administrative layer appears, wearing the mask of professionalism. A memo circulated dry, compliance scented, framed as a stability measure. In this story world, it carried a code that would mean nothing to civilians, but everything to the people who control the lanes. Rule 4. 7b. The language wasn't emotional. It never is. It described dislocation protocols, market integrity, risk management enhancements. And inside that sterile vocabulary were 3 practical changes that tell you exactly what time it is: tighter collateral schedules, more friction around deliverable conversion, and expanded flexibility for alternative settlement paths when conditions are disorderly. That last part is the velvet glove. When the system feels pressure, it doesn't announce surrender. It increases optionality. It creates more ways to close obligations without having to source scarce metal at the worst possible moment. To the public, that sounds like protection. To anyone tracking physical constraints, it sounds like preparation. Then I went one layer higher upstream where flow becomes a policy problem. Because if the military link channels are truly short components and lead times are stretching, markets won't fix that on a clean curve. Governments don't solve shortages by paying higher premiums at a coin shop. They solve shortages by prioritizing output. That's where DPass coding matters. DOJU. DX letters that don't show up on price charts but decide who eats first. In a stress regime, the supplier doesn't wake up and choose to ignore commercial orders out of greed. The supplier receives a rated order and suddenly has a legal reason to move it ahead of everything else. If you're a normal buyer, you're not outbid. You're outranked. I called a different desk than the one from earlier in the week, closer to wholesale. Less interested in retail chatter, I didn't ask for a price. I asked for a timeline. There was a pause, then a response that told me more than any quote ever could. Depends on what it is and who it's for, he said. If it's unrated, you're waiting. If it's rated, it moves. That sentence is the mechanism. The flow can be redirected without a single dramatic headline. And once flow is redirected, paper can still trade all day smooth. Liquid. Comforting, while physical becomes unobtainium for anyone who didn't secure it before the queue formed. By the end of that Friday night, the picture was clean enough to draw in one line. Backwardation signals immediate scarcity. Volatility activates hedging. Hedging pressures, shorts, and the system responds not by admitting stress, but by tightening margins and widening the definition of orderly settlement. The trap isn't that price moves. The trap is that access disappears first, while the screen continues to pretend everything is normal. The switch has flipped upstream. Next, civilians will learn what that means in the only language they trust: empty shelves, exploding premiums, and a mint that starts acting like a rationing office. That's when the panic begins. The moment you realize the market has stopped allocating by price, it lands like a punch. You can pay the premium and still be told to wait. That's when you understand this isn't a bull market. It's a priority queue. By Monday morning, December 29, 2025, I wasn't even looking for a breakout anymore. I was looking for proof that the queue had gone operational. The tape still had that composed, almost bored, look liquid prints, clean spreads, the illusion of normal. But the moment Globex woke up, The real market started speaking in a different dialect. Allocation. Delayed confirmation. Callback list. No firm ship date. I refreshed 3 dealer portals I hadn't opened since last quarter. 2 of them looked normal until you read the fine print. The third didn't bother pretending. Items were technically listed, but the buttons had changed from add to cart to notify me. That's a subtle psychological trap. It keeps the storefront open while quietly admitting there's nothing behind the glass. I called a wholesaler I usually treat like a thermometer. When things are healthy, they, quote, quickly, because replacement is easy. When things are stressed, they, quote, like lawyers, because replacement is uncertain. I gave them a simple request, nothing exotic, nothing niche, and asked for delivery. How soon do you need it? The rep asked. I didn't answer the way he wanted. I asked whether it was available. It's available, he said, and then paused like he'd just realized what that word no longer means. But it's not immediate. That was the new reality in one breath. Spot can be available indefinitely, but deliverable metal has a schedule, and the schedule is no longer yours to choose. I pressed for a ship window. He didn't give me a date. He gave me a condition. If they can replenish, the order moves. If they can't, you wait. The market had shifted from pricing to permissions. Then came the canary. The U. S. Is. Mint doesn't scream. It doesn't rant. It doesn't tweet. It does something far more revealing. It starts behaving like an institution managing scarcity. A distribution-style update circulated in the kind of language that's designed not to cause panic-limited throughput. Constrained blank sourcing. Managed releases. No drama, just administration. That's how rationing enters modern systems. Politely, through process. I wanted a street-level check, so I called a local shop contact in the States, not because he moves markets, but because he feels the consequences before the chart acknowledges them. He didn't sound excited. He sounded tired. You're late, he said, not as an insult, but as a fact. Everybody wants the same thing. Everybody wants it now. And the stuff I can get today isn't the stuff I can get next week. I asked him what people were doing. He told me the crowd had changed. A few days earlier, callers were price shopping. Now they were timeline shopping. They weren't asking, what's spot? They were asking, do you have it? That's the moment FOMO becomes real. Not the fear of missing a rally, the fear of missing access. The decoupling that started as premium noise was now obvious enough to measure without a microscope. Depending on form and delivery speed, the all-in street cost was effectively jumping another $5 to $10 per ounce equivalent above what the screen implied. Not because anyone was getting greedy overnight, but because replacement risk had become the true cost. When you can't restock confidently, every sale has to price in the possibility you won't be able to replace the inventory at anything resembling the paper, quote. And then the paper crowd tried to do what paper crowds always do in a stress regime. Convert. A guy I'd spoken to before, smart, confident, fully exposed through paper vehicles, called me with the kind of tone people only use when the rules stop matching their assumptions. He decided he wanted actual delivery, not because he loved metal, but because he suddenly didn't trust promises. He described the process like a maze, minimum sizes he hadn't noticed before, timelines that were subject to availability, and one phrase that kept repeating in different forms, there is no guarantee of immediate conversion. It wasn't an outright default. It was something subtler and more effective. Friction. Enough friction to make people accept cash equivalents without calling it surrender. By the time I closed my laptop, the pattern was unmistakable. The queue wasn't theoretical anymore. It was running. Dealers were managing flow, not selling inventory. The mint was signaling constraint without using the word. Paper holders were discovering that exposure and ownership diverge precisely when it matters most. And when the public finally notices the lockout, the leverage layer wakes up. Options dealers start hedging, shorts feel the margin bite, and orderly market becomes the only phrase anyone in the plumbing cares about. Next comes the phase that never stays quiet: instability. When a paper market is forced to face physical reality, it doesn't panic in public. It professionalizes the panic through margins, rule language, and settlement mechanics that sound safe until you realize what they allow. The contradiction had been building in layers: a calm screen, tightening physical availability, and a quiet reordering of who gets served first. By the week of January 5th, 2026, that pressure stopped living at the retail edge and migrated into the infrastructure, the place where trades aren't opinions, they're obligations. That's when the tone changes, not louder, sharper. Fewer theories, more procedures. This is a pressure chamber for silver because positioning matters more than headlines. Options exposure sits clustered around strikes like dry brush in a hot season. A small spark can trigger forced movement. In that setup, volatility isn't just an output, it becomes an input. When implied volatility rises, dealers don't get to argue with it. They hedge it. Delta moves, hedges adjust, and those hedges can become the very engine that pushes price through levels the market spent months pretending didn't exist. Gamma doesn't care what you believe. It cares what the book requires. Late on Thursday, January 8th for me in Bangkok, I watched the curve behave like a system under strain. Front-month tightness refused to relax. The market kept paying up for immediacy, which is another way of saying it was trying to bribe real metal out of hiding. In comfortable markets, time is cheap and delivery is assumed. In stressed markets, time becomes expensive and delivery becomes the variable everyone is quietly managing. At the same time, collateral began to stiffen. It didn't arrive with a dramatic announcement. It arrived as updated schedules, cleaner language, and a firmer tone, exactly how orderly conditions are maintained. Margin requirements tightened in a way that made leveraged exposure feel heavier overnight. You could see the behavioral shift in the flow. Fewer participants willing to carry risk into the weekend, more participants forced to reduce simply because the math stopped tolerating their size. That's where the short side meets the wall. A short can be confident right up until volatility expands and the collateral demand widens. Then confidence becomes irrelevant. Covering turns from strategy into triage. And in a market where immediate metal is already being priced as scarce, forced covering doesn't just lift price, it stresses the very promise structure the paper market is built on. Meanwhile, the hedging layer keeps doing what it must. If price drifts upward through option-heavy zones, dealer hedging often becomes incremental buying. That buying can push price farther, which forces more hedging. The feedback loop isn't emotional, it's mechanical, and mechanical loops don't stop because someone posts a calmer narrative. They stop when positioning clears, when liquidity absorbs, or when the system changes the rules of engagement. And that's the pivot most people miss. When the system senses the edge of disorder, it doesn't announce failure. It writes itself flexibility. A sterile notice circulated procedural soothing wrapped in language about integrity and stability. It referenced Rule 4, 7b, the dislocation framework that had been floating in the plumbing. The document didn't say, "We can't deliver." It didn't have to. It expanded tools, tighter collateral expectations, added friction around deliverable conversion, and a wider runway for alternative settlement paths if conditions became disorderly. That phrase disorderly is the doorway. It's the justification that turns an emergency measure into a compliance obligation. This is force majeure in a suit. Not a dramatic declaration, not a televised emergency, just a professional widening of exits. The promise remains a promise right up to the moment the system decides that keeping the game continuous matters more than honoring the spirit of delivery. Cash equivalent outcomes can be framed as protection while still functioning as a pressure valve. They prevent a scramble for scarce metal at the worst possible moment. That's why the real conflict here isn't simply does silver go up? It's whether settlement remains meaningfully tied to physical availability when stress peaks. In an allocation regime, you can be paid and still lose, because being made whole in dollars is not the same as being able to acquire the asset those dollars were supposed to represent. The screen can stay liquid while access evaporates. So here's the real question. If the rules can change the meaning of settlement when the system is threatened, what exactly did you own? There's only one strategy that survives an allocation regime: ownership, not exposure. This isn't just a silver story. It's a story about how wealth transfers in silence when the world moves from pricing assets to allocating them. By the time the infrastructure starts speaking in integrity, language, and collateral schedules, most people are already late. They're still staring at the screen, arguing about whether the move is real, while the real market has shifted under their feet. The last few weeks weren't a mystery. They were a pattern. Calm tape, tightening availability, priority signals, and then the professional panic rules that don't shout. They quietly redefine what counts as an orderly finish. If you want to survive that kind of regime, you have to stop thinking like a speculator and start thinking like a logistics analyst. In normal times, price is the gate. In stress times, access is the gate. And the biggest lie the paper era sells is that exposure equals ownership. It doesn't. Not when delivery is scarce, not when conversion is friction, not when the system is allowed to protect itself by changing the meaning of settlement. I draw the line in permanent ink because it's the only line that matters now. Owning a chart is not owning a bar. Owning a claim is not owning a supply. Owning exposure is not owning flow. And flow, this is the part most people will never internalize, is controlled upstream, where priority ratings and industrial allocations decide who gets served first. If you don't hold it, you don't own it. That sentence isn't a slogan. It's a diagnosis of how modern markets behave when they're stressed. When immediate metal turns into unobtainium, you learn the difference between I can sell and I can buy. Paper holders discover they can be exited sometimes smoothly, sometimes politely without ever receiving the thing they thought they were exposed to. They can be paid and still be locked out. Physical holders, on the other hand, aren't waiting on anyone's definition of orderly. They already solved the hardest problem, access. That's how the transfer happens without a parade. The paper crowd gets made whole in dollars and believes that means they won. Then they try to use those dollars to acquire the scarce asset. And they find the shelves are empty, the wait lists are long, and the premiums are now the real price. The physical crowd doesn't win because they guessed a candle. They win because they took delivery before delivery became a privilege. In an allocation regime, 3 rules dominate everything. Ownership beats exposure when settlement can be rewritten under stress. Access beats price when the flow is being rerouted upstream. Discipline beats emotion when volatility is weaponized to shake out the weak hands. That third rule matters more than people want to admit. The system doesn't need to steal from you. It only needs to scare you into selling the one thing that can't be printed. When volatility spikes, headlines flip hourly, and the tape starts behaving like a trap, the unprepared crowd does what it always does. It panics at the wrong moment. They sell claims into chaos and accept cash outcomes because the cash feels safe. Then the next day, the same cash can't buy the same access. So the practical question becomes simple. What do you watch to know the regime is shifting again? Not predictions. Indicators. Premiums versus spot. Lead times. Allocation language. The difference between available and deliverable. Curve structure whether the market is paying for now. Margin schedule changes that signal the plumbing is tightening. And the most underrated indicator of all, when dealers stop speaking in prices and start speaking in timelines. None of this requires apocalyptic fantasies. It requires honesty about incentives. A strategic buyer doesn't care about your comfort. A clearing system doesn't care about your conviction. They care about continuity and priority. If you understand that, you stop treating silver like a meme and start treating it like what it is in this regime. A strategic choke point that exposes the weakness of paper promises. This crisis didn't begin with a headline. It began with a quiet change in availability. And now that you've seen the pattern, you'll spot it early next time before the system admits anything is wrong. I stare at the same quiet screen that swore everything was orderly. Then I look down at the cold weight in my hand and the silence finally makes sense. In a world of paper promises, only metal is truth. And fiat is just a story that ends the moment the system needs an escape hatch. They called me paranoid for trading convenience, for certainty. But when the crowd was pushed to the back of the line, I realized I was never chasing profit. I was securing freedom. So hold what you hold. And don't keep this safety to yourself. Wake the others up before the doors close. Because what you and I are carrying now isn't just silver. It's an anchor in a storm that paper can't survive.